European imperialism in Asia. Actually, we should probably call this European imperialism all over the place because, they did the same thing to Africa too. This is what they like to call the Great Divergence. This is why Europe ends up taking over most of the planet. It's a term coined by Samuel Huntington, also called the European miracle, referring by which the process by which the Western world, i.e., Europe, overcame pre-modern growth constraints and emerged during the 19th century, the most powerful and wealthy world civilization of all time, eclipsing everybody else. And how did they do this? Well, part of it's the Industrial Revolution. The reason they go out to take over other places, they're producing so much stuff they need to sell it to other places. And they're going to force their way into these other markets. And the reason they can force their way into the other market, they have actual organized military and with industrial might. They can produce a lot of weapons, a lot of ships, a lot of everything they need. And furthermore, they've established colonies, kind of like the United States. They'll do it Africa and Asia to a degree as well, which is a market they can control, which they can sell stuff to. And they get the raw materials from those places. So it's kind of like mercantilism all over again. And another thing that, your book doesn't really get into this, but something I've noticed from studying this stuff for a long time is all these European countries, Britain, France, Germany, Spain, they're all wedged together and competing against each other. So they've been competing against each other for a very long time. And when they show up in China, China hasn't had any competition. So they're not sure how to react to these sudden new predatory powers that show up on their doorstep. So something to consider. Alrighty, let's go chop up China. Now, the Manchurians conquered China in 1644. Some people call them the Qing Dynasty. I just call them Manchus. And did they really conquer China? Because you know what happens when people allegedly conquer China. What happened to the Mongols? Right, they conquer China. Genghis Khan conquers it. And what happens in 3 generations? His grandson, Kublai Khan, is living in Beijing and he's speaking Chinese half the time. Same thing's going to happen to the Manchurians. They're going to conquer China, and what happens in 3 generations? Up here's Manchuria, capital's Harbin, and 3 generations, boom, capital's in Beijing, everybody's speaking Chinese. You can't even find people speaking Manchurian anymore. In fact, they just call this the Northeast. So, everything that happens, China ends up absorbing everybody. And in fact, the Manchu dynasty officially lasts until 1912. We're not even calling it Manchuria after about 1700. They're just calling it China because everyone's speaking Chinese. We have a Chinese emperor. The capital's in Beijing, right? See the point? Nonetheless, let's talk about how the Manchurians conquered China, at least how they think they conquered China. Hello, we're your neighbors. The Manchurians look kind of like Mongols, don't they? Because they live next door to them. Marvel at our great hats. Yes, they wore these hats kind of as a uniform. Also notice the quilted armor. The one thing that survives in allegedly Manchurian China all the way up to the present day are these hats because they're really cool. All right, the Manchurian conquest of China started in 1618. Who's the king of the Manchurians? Narahachi invades China from the northeast. Has help some Mongol offshoots called the Korchin. Yep, they're still Mongols. They're still running around a place called Mongolia. It's a very, very long war. All right, they're going to destroy the Ming Dynasty. Just before the Ming Dynasty is destroyed at the Battle of Shanghai Pass in 1644, a guy named Li Zicheng kind of overthrew the government, declared himself the Emperor of the Shun, and then walked over and lost at Shanghai Pass. So, end of the game right there. There's still some holdouts in southern China all the way until 1683 because, you're near Tibet, you got the Himalayas, and then, of course, the border over there with Burma and Vietnam, it's dense jungle. So, Manchurian's going to be busy for a while, but 1644, they've got most of it. There we are. Manchu equals king, 1644 to 1912. And by the time we get to 1912, we're not even calling them that. We're calling them Chinese. This is how big the Manchurian Empire is. And look at the present borders. They're a little bit smaller. Wouldn't you notice? Because Mongolia will pull away in 1911, Russian help. The Russians will take this away from the Chinese and that as well. See Vietnam. Everyone's going to nibble away at China because it's called the century of humiliation. Yep, that's coming up. So China is big enough, as you can see. Basically, they can turn inward and ignore the world. Right? That's what they have to do. They have a history of turning in on itself. But China's population skyrockets. It's always been big. In 1650, 150 million people lived there. By 1800, 300 million people. And though China's pretty big, remember, everybody lives on that eastern third, right? That's where everybody lives. Because the further inland you go, it becomes drier, more arid, lots of deserts. So the population gets big. There's only so many places people can live because on the eastern third of the country, Chinese have to immigrate somewhere. And where do they go? Everywhere. Why is there a picture of Heinz Field? I just felt like putting it there. That's why. They immigrate to Southeast Asia. They immigrate to Malaysia. And you know where else they end up going? California, just in time for the gold rush in 1849 and railroad construction. That's where all the Chinese population, descendant population of the West Coast comes from. 1849, the gold rush, showing up for gold, looking for people to build railroads. And one thing the Chinese are good at, building lots of stuff using lots of labor. Great Wall of China come to mind. So many Chinese showed up, it really caused a panic in California, and there's a couple of reasons for it. One, the Chinese, they come from a culture that's completely alien to anything we've seen up to this point. Almost our immigration would come either from Europe, Mediterranean, even Latin America, something, people we've dealt with for a while, people we kind of understand. Asia is a completely different world, and it really scares people when they deal with something that's much different. Plus, a lot of Chinese showed up, almost 250,000, which by Chinese standards is basically nothing. It's the change you find underneath the couch. To us, 250,000 is a lot of people. So there's another example of a lot of differences between the Western view of the world and the Chinese view of the world. Now, China, because it's so big and can ignore the world, has often seen itself as the center of the planet. They had the greatest wealth, the greatest technology, everything was awesome in China. The Chinese had a way, usually justified, of looking down their nose at the rest of the world. 19th century is going to change a little bit. There's limited contact with the West, except through the British and India and Tibet, where you got to come through the Himalayas, and through the port of Canton, or as the Chinese like to call it, Guangzhou. You have to present yourself before the emperor in a way that stresses Chinese superiority. In other words, the kowtow, ironically a Mongol word. You have to bow in front of the Chinese emperor and acknowledge his superiority. That's how China views the world. And up until about the 19th century, they're quite justified in that. But things are changing very quickly because the world has shot past China, the Great Divergence, and it's coming for them. This tells you everything you need to see here. From the Second Opium Wars, a couple British soldiers, some French soldiers. Look at the weapons they have. Take a look at the Chinese weapons. Yeah, I see bows and arrows and spears. They don't work so great against repeating rifles. Here comes the century of humiliation from 1839 until 1949, what they call the glorious communist revolution. But we'll get there soon enough. Let's go back to the first Opium War. That's right, the British are in the drug business. It's not exactly, Tony Montana, but, they're shipping a lot of opium into China, and as you've guessed, it's causing a lot of problems. You see it here in the 21st century in America. Same deal, lots of problems. China decides they don't want to do this anymore. Great Britain is going to force their way in. China resorts to force to keep the British out, and it's basically a war between the 19th century and the 16th century because the British have modern weaponry. They have the cannons, you have the ship of the line, troops land on the shore, they've got modern weapons, modern artillery, and they just wipe the floor up with the Chinese there. They don't try to conquer China because China's just too bloody big. But they're not really interested in that. They're interested in other stuff. The Treaty of Nanjing, the British take Hong Kong away from the Chinese. Not only have they defeated the Chinese, they've taken a small piece of important land, also very symbolic. There's no tariffs on British goods coming into China, so you can't charge any tariffs. Anything that's Chinese made is going to get pushed away by the British because, they're making stuff mass production back in Britain and shipping it over. They give Britain the most favored nation status. That means no tariffs, but Britain has to. Britain can slap tariffs on the Chinese if they want, and British extraterritoriality. I can't say this word. Territoriality. That means the British, if they do something naughty, can't be punished under Chinese law without British permission. Yeah, you can tell who won this war. And of course, no more kowtow. If I'm speaking to any Chinese official, I look him in the eyes and we speak frankly. End of story. As you've guessed, China's not happy about this. How did this happen? Years and years of Chinese superiority, and they get their butt handed to them by the British. Well, they try to find their way out of this. They're not used to this kind of treatment. They get mad, and we got ourselves a second Opium War in 1856. The British and the French this time are on the same side. Remember Napoleon III? And they beat up on the Chinese again. And now we get to what we call concessions. They're not interested in Chinese territory, maybe a port or two, a couple pieces here and there, but they're not trying to conquer China because it's simply too big. They're interested in concessions. Talk about that in a second. Making things worse for the Chinese, we got the Taiping Rebellion. Peasant uprising happens all the time in China. This one's pretty big. 50 million people killed. It's actually bigger than the Second World War. When China does something, they go big or they go home, right? Peasant uprising 1851, 1866. Guy named Hong Qian, who thought he was Jesus. Yes, he brought in Christians, Buddhists, Hindu, everybody he could find to fight this war against the corrupt dynasty. And if you remember from Mr. H's world history class, remember the Mandate of Heaven? Clearly, the Qing dynasty, or Manchus, have lost the Mandate of Heaven. We've got a peasant uprising. We've got imperialists from outside the country winning. We've also got famine and drought. That's what caused the rebellion. So people are very upset with the Chinese government. You can't keep the foreigners out. You can't keep the gods happy. Everything's falling apart, and I'm supposed to stay loyal to you. Not happening. And then here comes Japan. They beat up on the Chinese 1894 to 1895. They take away Korea and also take Taiwan. So now you're losing to these European imperialists. Fellow Asians from a small Asian country are beating up on China. The Mandate of Heaven has not only been lost, it has slipped down the drain and not coming back. Europeans are chopping up Japan. Look at this. We've got Queen Victoria over here. We've got the Germans. Here's the Russians, Marianne of France, and look who's joining them. Yep, it's Japan. Thought Japan would go easy on China because they're fellow Asians? Nope, they're just as bad as the Europeans. Concessions and sphere of influence. Let's talk about that a bit. Now, China is way too big to conquer. We already know this, right? People have found out. So the Europeans and Japan are going to wring out these concessions from China. What's a concession? Think of it as a tick. It jumps on some animal's back and just sucks the blood out. It doesn't want to kill the animal. It's just going to keep sucking a little bit of blood, yeah, and keep the money rolling. So definition, we have a concession around the area of, say, Canton, right? Canton belongs to the British, but the area around it does not. So the area is Chinese, but the European power in charge, China, France, Germany, Russia, everybody starts coming in, even the Japanese. The European power in charge of the area makes the money that comes off this area. So it belongs to China, but the money's going back to Europe. The U.S. were kind of late to this party, so we took over the Philippines from the Spanish, and we proposed the open door where everybody's free to trade anywhere they want in China. Actually, as you probably guessed, the Europeans and Japanese aren't going for this. The government is impotent. It can't do anything. Can't even protect its own people from these predators. So the Boxer Rebellion explodes, a society of righteous fists. One huge uprising to expel the Europeans and Japanese. The Boxers promote this mythology that somehow they're immune to bullets and artillery. Newsflash, you're not. There are even women who joined, call themselves the Red Lanterns. Allegedly, they could glide through the air and stuff like this. And see in some movies, that's where it came from. Again, gravity kind of, makes itself known at all the worst times. And it's going to be an epic fail. And once again, China is humiliated. China has not forgotten this. This might explain current Chinese foreign policy. Now, here's the difference between a formal empire and an informal empire, right? The Europeans and Japanese are building up basically an informal empire. A formal empire, think Roman Empire. Direct control is run directly from the capital. Often there's a military occupation involved. You're not seeing that in China because it's just simply too big. So the Europeans have gone for an informal empire. It's indirect, right? The sphere of influence kind of thing, often economic, and it's invisible. You don't see very often any British troops or French troops in China. You might see a couple here or there, but not very many. There's no garrison put over there. So, all the money that's being made goes back to Paris, London, St. Petersburg, Tokyo, but you don't see soldiers walking around. Now, Japan, a little bit different. Formal and informal, they take Korea for themselves, and of course, and Taiwan, but most of Manchuria is a Japanese sphere of influence, and the Russians, of course, are building railroads that they own across China. They don't own it, but they basically rent free and they make all the money off of it. So formal empire versus informal empire. That's also why South America never got attacked by the Europeans. The British, with the biggest navy, kind of fenced it off from everybody and had the whole informal empire in South America where they're making all the money off that, and they're not letting anybody near the till. All right, so here's Asia, right? 1900, this is kind of what's going on when I talk about sphere of influence. Look at this. This is what China actually makes their money from. Not very big, is it? This is a British sphere of influence. They make their money. It's the Yellow River here. They make their money from here. All this, anything happens in here, goes straight to the British pocket. See here with the French? Anything here goes to the French pocketbook. The Russians, Russian pocketbook, they just took this for themselves right here. This would be direct empire, conquered it. But the rest of this, informal empire. Mongolia becomes a client state. They even change the borders, make more money off this. Here's Japan. They take Korea. They take Taiwan over here, call it Formosa. But this is what we call a formal empire, and this is their sphere of influence. All the money here goes to Japan. So basically, China's getting carved up like a pizza. There's really nothing they can do to stop this. And they haven't forgotten about all of this, right? This explains why their foreign policy is kind of the way it is. Here's the British in India, see, coming through Tibet, their own sphere of influence. This is not accurate. I have no idea why Afghanistan has been mixed up with Iran, but they put it in this map. Now, Japan's got a whole different view to this thing, right? They're going to modernize themselves. Whereas China is trying to go back to the way it was, Japan is heading towards the way it will be. They already see what the West is doing, and they figure, let's imitate it and do it better. Imitation's the best form of flattery. As you can see, some people are kind of resisting the idea, but this is to be expected. Now, why did Japan modernize? Well, because of us. We're the ones who started it. That's right, America. In 1853, Matthew Perry sends a trade expedition straight into Tokyo Harbor. It's the U.S. Navy. He demands that Japan give U.S. preferential trading treatment. He also points the cannons directly at the Imperial Palace, and they fire some blank shots as celebration, allegedly, of the new U.S.-Japanese friendship. But they also see the modern weaponry. They know what cannons can do. There's a lot of quote-unquote demonstrations where they invite the Japanese to watch, i.e., give us the money or we're going to blow your country into next week. So before then, Japan, much like China, had very limited contact with the outside world. Foreign traders, usually Dutch, were allowed through the port of Nagasaki. This was a policy called sakuku. Sometimes this is an O, sometimes it's a U, depends who you talk to. And now with the Americans showing up, forcing their way into trade, the other Europeans come swooping their way in too. So Japan figures it's a good idea to figure out these guys' technology. And the first thing they buy, of course, repeating rifles. They take it apart, put it back together, see how it's done. They actually start their own program called Dutch Studies. Yeah, Ranguku. That's because dealt with the Dutch more than anyone else, right? So this is how they take apart Western technology, put it back together, Western ways, rebuild their army, and become modern. The emperor who begins this in 1868 is a guy called Musuto. Emperor Meiji, means enlightened age. This is his imperial name. He becomes the emperor in 1868. And before then, it was the Tokugawa shogunate was running everything. Shogun, the warlords. He becomes the emperor. There's usually a figurehead. Not anymore. He remodels the army and takes it from the shogunate. There's some residual shoguns. They made a movie about it, but yeah, he takes it back. And as brave as the samurai are, your armor and swords don't really match up against repeating rifles. He even creates a new government, the Meiji Constitution. It's a constitutional monarchy in theory with a bit of an authoritarian angle to it. In other words, it's going to be run from the background by what they call a zaibatsu. It's the rich and the militarists, the one who do get on board, because they can see what Japan can do. Because the one thing you notice about Japan, they tend to do things right the first time. It's a small country with very little resources, so they can't really screw around. And because they have very little resources, they're going to have to reach out and take those resources, kind of from Korea and from China. If you think about it, it's kind of a Japanese version of Manifest Destiny. Here we are, another one of Mr. H's before and after. Before, 1853, 1941, they kick us in the teeth at Pearl Harbor. In 1853, we're talking samurais, armor, katana swords, really awesome, but doesn't really work too great in the 19th century. By 1941, less than 100 years later, the Japanese hit us right in the mouth at Pearl Harbor with carrier battle groups, battleships, submarines, and the Japanese Zero, an airplane better than anything we had at the time. Like I said, the Japanese, when they get rolling on something, they hit it with everything they got, and they get it right the first time. So Japan is getting into the imperialist game. Again, I have to stress this. The Japanese are not coming to save fellow Asians. The Japanese are just as bad as the Europeans, and on occasion, as we saw at the Bataan Death March, worse than the Europeans. They have no problem attacking other countries. And when it comes to Asian imperialism, they've got the advantage because, they live there. The Sino-Japanese War, we talked about that. They beat up on the Chinese. 1894, 1895, they take Korea, they take Taiwan. Britain sees how dangerous Japan is, so they decide to negotiate a neutrality treaty as an equal in 1902. Plus, they got stuff to worry about back in Europe with Germany. Then they launch a sneak attack on the Chinese. They launch a sneak attack on the Russians. You're noticing a pattern here, and they're going to defeat the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, and they've got all the rights to Manchuria. Talk about humiliation. The Russians and Japanese are fighting on Chinese territory to see who gets to run it, and you don't get anything out of this. The Russians fight hard, but they lose a couple fleets because the Japanese have modern battleships, modern weapons, a modern army with that samurai mentality, and they defeat the Russians. Of course, the Russians had a revolution break loose in St. Petersburg in 1905, had to go back and deal with that. But believe me, Japan's still going to win this thing. All righty. Well, I've been torturing you here for quite a long bit here on European and Japanese imperialism in Asia. We'll take a quick look here at India and we'll call it a day. Now, the British have been involved in India since at least the 1600s. There it was tea. Remember, over here they looked for gold and silver, didn't find it. There's tobacco, then cotton, then manufactured goods. India, it's been all about tea. The British, East India Company's running that. Now, originally, it was the Portuguese who came here. Later on, it's the French and the Dutch. So you know how the British, French, and Dutch feel about each other. They've always been friends with Portugal, so they're just competitors. But eventually, the British, through either direct British rule or indirect, are going to conquer India. And back during the 7 Years' War, Battle of Plassey, they defeat the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies, and Britain becomes supreme in India. So they basically control the entire Indian Ocean, and this is what lets them into China, albeit the hard way, through the Himalayas, and of course competition with the Russians over here in Central Asia and Afghanistan has been a pain in the butt for everybody since Alexander the Great. British will keep India until 1949. We'll get around to that soon enough. All right, European and Japanese imperialism in East Asia. You guys have a great day, and I will talk to you later.